neighbor wanting to borrow a cup of sugar. And it really gets into the discussion really is, what if someone wants to borrow something from you, not because they're actually quite needy to have money to put food on the table, but rather just for convenience. They can either run down to the store, or they can borrow a cup of sugar or a couple of eggs or whatever they need to finish baking the cake, right? So is there the same mitzvah of halva'a mid'oraisa? Now, there's no question that there's obviously a chesed involved to save someone the hassle, but the point that Rav Stern was making is that there's no mitzvah mid'oraisa of halva'a in that kind of scenario. He says ibra. So that's what we've seen up until now. Ibra usually is a term that implies on the other hand.
Sure.
Am I showing my screen? Yeah, okay, now I'm showing my screen. Let me show my screen. Sorry. For some reason, my computer's a little slow today. Okay, Ibra. Benidon didan hayanira lanius daiti. Degam im hamakolet nimtzeit bekirav makom mamish. It would seem to me that you could make the argument, on the other hand, that even if the makolet is right down the road, Sobeys is right down the block, and you could always get what your neighbor could always get what she needs without a lot of tircha, but instead she comes to you to ask for the cup of sugar. Mikol makom efshar diyesh bo chiyuv gomer lahalvosa. It still could be that there's an absolute obligation to lend it to her. The hatam to kevin degam sham tzarech liknos hadavar imkein shaykh bazem mitzvah salva. He says because the option is for either her to borrow without money or to go to the store and use money to buy. He says therefore it could be that there's a mitzvah to save her not only the hassle but also the expenditure. The bishlama im yeshlo davar shalo bekirav makom rak mit atzel hu leilech lasham. He says in a situation where a person has, let's say, access to something that already is in his possession, but he's lazy. He doesn't want to have to walk down the road to get something that belongs to him already. He says bazeh yeshlomer she'en kan chiyuv daharei yeshlo. So there you could argue that there's no obligation to lend something to him when he already has it. And it could be like the case in Ksuvas that we saw last time. What was the case that we saw last time? Let's just refresh our memory. Let's see. I don't recall him referencing a case in Maseches Ksuvas. Yeah. Imrei yeshlo ve'eno rotza lihisparnis eni nizkaken lo. The Gemara in Ksuvas says that if a person has something that already belongs to him, but he doesn't want to use it, he'd rather borrow the same item from someone else, then you don't have to listen to him, right? It was just a generic statement from the Gemara in Ksuvas. He says, right? And therefore, if a person has something already and he just doesn't want to bother to use his own item and would rather borrow the same item from someone else, he says, yeah, I've got my own corkscrew, but yours is nicer. I'd rather use yours. For whatever argument he wants to make. So I don't have to lend you my corkscrew if you've got your own. He says, "Aval hecha shegam bekirav makom eno mishalo, ela shetzarach liknoso." But it could be that in our situation, where the person doesn't have the item already, and they would have to go out and buy it if I don't lend it to them. He says, even though the person I know could easily buy themselves a dozen eggs or a bag of sugar, but it still could be that I have an obligation to lend it to them If they ask me, "Achadain yesh la'aynim lachaver yesh lo bevesu ma lechol, uba mevakesh eze davar miyuchad shechafetz ka'es la'achol," but we could granulate this issue even more. He says, my friend has food in the house. They're not going hungry, but they want to bake a cake, right? Whether it's Shabbos or birthday cake, whatever the occasion is. This is not a situation where my friend's going to go hungry if I don't lend them the item, but they want to make a special dessert for their child's birthday. So he says, Haim gam zen nichlal b'chiyuva? Is that included in the obligation of lending? If they're not going to go hungry, it's just they won't have a birthday party with the cake. Umakam hasafik dematzinu birashba abchavhei deisa sham begamar delitein staka havalei mushba va'omed. He says the Rashba comments on this idea in the context of the mitzvah of tzedakah, where we were forsworn. If that's right, that's not the right word. We were placed under an oath when we were at Har Sinai. We obligated ourselves to perform the mitzvah of tzedakah. And he writes, "V'nira li the dafka b'matana mu'etes kedei parnasa l'shah." He says, it seems that the obligation that I have to a fellow Jew to sustain him is not an obligation to give him as much as he needs for the long term. All I'm obligated to do is to give someone enough for a meal for the day. Just to give someone, let's say, money that he needs for lodging for the night. Shekol ze nichnas bichlal masha amru elala asher dilamala min hatzarach lo achshav asher hu ad kamosham. He says, but anything above and beyond that is not part of my obligation in the mitzvah of tzedakah. He says, "V'im kein lefi dvarav shel Rashba noimar dehol v'yesh l'shcheno ka'es malechol sha'ar dvarim." And therefore, we could make the following argument: my neighbor has ample food in the house. Okay, they're not an ani, and even as far as needing food for the moment, they don't. Im kein lo yichayev lahalvosu min haTorah de'ein ze adif mitzdaka. He says, so therefore, I'm not obligated to give them a loan because it's no different from the mitzvah of tzedakah. He wants to argue that just like tzedakah is that there's a mitzvah to give someone charity to sustain them temporarily, so too there's a mitzvah to loan someone money when they're in a situation of need. But this is not really called need. Just because they want to bake a cake for a birthday party doesn't mean that that's a case of need. So he's going back and forth on this issue. He says, "Achnira lidekushta demilsa ze'eno." But I would like to counter argue that. He says, "Demasha kasav harashba ein ze omer ela le'inyan kamos anesina the alzeh kasav the im yesh lo la'ani ka'es mazon kedei lina mashitzarach lo achshav ein shum chiyav litein lo yoser shiyaspik lo le'emshech azman." Because the Rashba was addressing the sustenance of a poor person who, let's say, may have enough to get by for today. And so in that situation, he writes, you don't have an obligation to give him additional tzedakah to sustain him for the long term, as long as he has what to eat today. That's the context of his discussion. But as far as the quality of the food, let's say a person has food, but he wants a higher quality of food, that the Rashba did not address. And he says that all depends on what the person is used to doing. He says, in Hilchos tzedakah, if a person, let's say, has the bare essentials, but he is of a standard of living that he's used to having when he has wealth, to not just have bread and water, but he has something to put in the bread, and he usually has a beverage as well. So that's what he's used to eating. So therefore, we know from Hilchos tzedakah, mikol makom mavur b'sugya d'ksuvos, the chayv litin lo hamachal haragilo v'afilu targed negolis petuma. The example over there is that there was a man who had a major loss of fortune. He went overnight from a wealthy man to a pauper. And Rava instructed one of his family members that you have to sustain this person according to his regular standard of living. And therefore, it's not just enough to give them a small amount of money for bread and water, you have to give them the amount that they're normally used to eating. If they normally would have chicken every night for dinner, that's what you have. You have to give them a chicken dinner every night because that's sustaining them according to their standard of living. He says, so obviously we need to qualify that as well, but but of course, that's a situation where the person would feel really put out if he didn't have that particular meal, because that's what his standard is. And he says, I refer you to the Gemara in Ksubis, Gemara relates a story that a person was regularly ate meat and wine at every meal, and someone gave him lentils instead for the meal, and he died. Man, I talk about a snowflake, right? It could be just caught up with him, right? V'lachein av sheyesh lo beveso kikar lechem mikol makom mimevakesh mishcheno lahalvos davar chiyuni kagom gevina o yirakot uchadome sheragilo ochlam imalechem chayav lahalvot lo. He says, therefore, let's say your neighbor comes to your door and says, I just forgot to go shopping. Is there anything? Can I borrow some food from you? And so you say to your neighbor, well, what do you have in the house? You say, well, I have bread, but I don't have anything to put on the bread. I don't have cheese. I don't have vegetables. So in that situation, if their standard of living is not to eat plain bread, but to make a sandwich and to put something on the bread, then it could be that you're obligated, just like you're obligated to give them tzedakah, you're obligated to lend to them also. Since that's their norm is not just to get by with bread. But he says, but that's different, let's say, from a scenario where your neighbor has plenty of food in the house. They've got the cheese and the vegetables and the tuna and the peanut butter and jam, and they've got everything they need, but they want to make a cake. I want to make muffins, right? Or whatever they want to make, or waffles, right? So, and they just need that cup of sugar or that cup of flour because they have this craving, or they want, their grandkids are over and they want to make them a special breakfast, whatever it is. And he has normally what he needs to eat. So there, Rav Stern says, no obligation to lend it to them because of the obligation of halva, of a loan. He says, because they have plenty to eat, and all they're looking for is the luxury of being able to make a birthday cake. And he says that that's considered to be over and beyond what the obligation that the Torah places upon you to lend someone money. Imrei also writes that if an ani comes to you, and he comes from a standard of living where he usually eats a chicken dinner every night, and he comes to you for tzedakah, and he wants to have his chicken dinner again, you're not obligated to give him more than what your standard of living is. So that's an interesting caveat, which is not really clear in the Gemara either. But the bottom line is that what he's basically saying is that we can delineate or distinguish between essential needs that a person comes to you when he wants to borrow money and something that is above and beyond his essential needs. So let's say a person wants to invest in, he has an investment opportunity. He'll be fine without doing the investment, but he has an opportunity to make a real killing, let's say, on a particular venture. And he asks you if he could borrow the money. That's quite different from the mitzvah of halva'ah that we're dealing with now. You don't have an obligation from the Torah to lend someone money if he is a middle class kind of guy and has plenty to feed with which to feed his family, but he wants to borrow money from you so that he has an opportunity to really do well on a certain investment. First of all, you can tell him, well, you can go to the bank and take out a small business loan or whatever you want to do. Um, he doesn't. He says, yeah, but I don't want to pay the interest. If I borrow it from you, I'll get by without paying interest. So you say to him, and I'm not interested. Yeah. In other words, that's all very well and good, but I'd rather hold on to my money for my own investment opportunities. Okay. So anyway, right, right. Again, there are many factors that have to be taken into account when a guy comes to you and says, "I want my chicken dinner." Right? I can give to another guy who's not used to eating chicken dinners. There's no shortage of aniyim. So it all depends on the situation. But if this is the only person in front of you right now, so then you have to give. Okay. And it's really the Gemara is really teaching you maybe not necessarily a real world example all the time, but it's teaching you a value. And the value is that the mitzvah of tzedakah extends to a person's feelings as well. You have to try your best to make a person feel whole when they undergo a serious financial downturn. If someone in your community, has a serious turn in their fortune, and they used to be the one who would sponsor the kiddushes and always gave above and beyond, and now they find themselves sadly in a totally different situation, the mitzvah of tzedakah requires you to bolster and prop them up until they're back on their feet. Right? That's empathy over sympathy. Yeah. But it's even more than empathy, because empathy, arguably doesn't require an action. It requires a certain compassion that you have for the individual. It's one madrega to not be resentful or hostile towards someone who displays anxiety, right? That's empathy. Here, it's even more than that. Here, it's what can I do to make this person feel whole again while they dig themselves out of the hole that they currently find themselves in. Okay. 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 So there's a halacha that if I have two people that I can lend money to, I can either lend money with interest to a Gentile, or I can lend money to a Jew without the interest, without the loan-bearing interest. So the halacha is you have an obligation to lend the money to a Jew, even though you're not going to get the interest payment, which could be sometimes a bitter pill to swallow. It could be, especially if you need the income to survive. So, Ayin be'imrei Yaakov pluktas aposkim igam b'makom shaharevachu gadol chayev lahaktim ha'Yisrael. So, we noticed in the Imrei Yaakov, he mentioned that there's a machlokus in the poskim. What if the return on the loan to the Gentile is significant to the point where you, like Moshe said, that you end up profiting and living off of that income? So the Gemara in Bava Metzia says that if it's a choice between a fellow Jew and a non-Jew, the Jew takes precedence. And the Gemara asks, Pshita, Amar Rav Nachman, lo nitzracha dafilu lenachi berbis l'Yisrael b'china. And the Gemara says, isn't that obvious? The Gemara says it's not obvious, because if I can give the loan to the Jew without interest and the loan to the non-Jew with interest, the chiddush is that the Jew still takes priority. And the these achronim ask the question, but still, isn't that obvious that we know that there's a general principle that if you can that if you can give to a righteous Gentile a ger toshav, versus selling to an idolater, you give to the righteous Gentile before you sell to the idolater. So obviously a Jew will take priority. So why do you need an additional Gemara to tell you the same principle? That's really their question. But so the Gemara, the other Gemara that says that the righteous Gentile takes priority is talking about a scenario where you have a piece of carrion, like you have your cow died, and you either have the option of giving the meat to a righteous Gentile, because the Torah says, right, if you have lo sochlu kol nevela, la ger b'sher b'artzacha titanenu va'achala, o machor lenochri. So the Torah says either give the meat, give the carcass to a righteous Gentile, or sell it to a non-Jew. And so the chiddush of the Gemara says the reason why the Torah writes it in that order, either give it to the righteous Gentile or sell it to the idolater, sell it to the heathen, is because the priority is first give it to the righteous Gentile. And if you can't find a righteous Gentile who wants to take it, then you have permission to sell it to the heathen. So we learn from there that the righteous Gentile takes priority even though you're not going to make any money. So why do you need a separate Gemara to tell you that a loan to a Jew takes precedence over a loan with interest to a non-Jew? So the answer is that there, because the meat may be just a small amount of meat, and it's not therefore a significant loss. Masha'en came beribis to who hefsid meruba, but let's say with a loan which is going to bear interest, which is going to cause you tremendous loss if you don't make that loan, sheyesh bazen manias revach gadol havamina de'en chiyuv lahaktana Yisrael. I might have thought, I'm sorry, it's the allergies. I might have thought that since there's a huge amount of loss involved, that maybe you're not obligated to lend the money to the Jew. Kamash Melanda filu hachi ha-Yisrael kodem. And therefore the chiddush is that no, the Jew takes priority even when there may be a significant loss by you not making the loan on interest to the Gentile. So that seems to be a statement that even when there's significant loss involved, by not making the loan on interest, that you have an obligation to give the loan without interest to the Jew. But we're not done yet. But the Chafetz Chaim has a different answer to that question of why do you need a separate Gemara to teach you that a loan to a Jew takes priority over a loan to a Gentile, if we already know that giving the carrion to the righteous Gentile takes priority over selling the carrion to a heathen. So he says, he says, because over there, by the ger toshav, the righteous Gentile, we're dealing with a poor man, that you have a mitzvah to give him tzedakah. When you have righteous Gentiles living in your midst, you have to sustain them. Masha'en kain, be'inyan halva, demari afilu ba'ashad lo shayach bazeh she'im nas atzman revach kedei lakayim v'cheyachicha imach. He says, but in a situation of loans, maybe the fellow is not an ani who's asking you for a loan. Maybe he's an usher and it just happens to be short of cash at the moment. So therefore, I might have thought that I'm not obligated. And therefore, the Gemara is saying that you nevertheless have an obligation to lend him the money, even though you could use this money and make money with interest if you gave it to a non-Jew. And therefore, says the Chafetz Chaim, it could be that only when there's a small amount of profit to be made on the loan to the Gentile do we say that no, you have an obligation first to lend it to the Jew. So basically, the Chafetz Chaim understands that this mitzvah of prioritization of a loan without interest to a Jew is even when the Jew doesn't need this money for his sustenance, but is rather looking for a loan to cover his, let's say, his business or something like that. Ve'al zeh ba hakra lahaktim ha'Yisrael ha'asher. He says, and that's where the pasuk says that the Jew takes priority. Aval la'nius daiti dvar malot sar tzricha biur. But he says, but it still needs further analysis. He says, because the papashtos hadar minan d'Yisrael asher kadam lenachri beribis. He says, because when we say that a Yisrael takes priority over a non-Jew, zenemar rak hecha she'asher nitzrach lazeh letzarach parnasaso u'chemo shekasav kan harav lahedja. He says, but that's only where he needs it for his sustenance. But there is no obligation, like we learned in the Imrei Yaakov, to lend someone money when he just wants to invest it to make a profit. He says, in a situation where a Jew just wants a loan because he has an investment opportunity, but otherwise he'll be okay, even if you don't lend him the money, he'll be able to get by. Then obviously, if you can use that money and make a profit off of it, you're not obligated to lend it to the Jew. Why should I lose money so that you can make money? That doesn't make any sense. Even if, let's say, your friend tells you, you don't understand. My investment opportunity is I can double the money if you lend it to me. You're just going to put it in the bank and bear, 5% interest. But I can actually double my money. So he says, but still you're not obligated. To bishlama im chaber ha'Yisrael tzarach zel tzarach parnasaso hagam dehu asher b'kol makom hol v'chayis ein lo moos mezumanim v'hu nitzrach lehem leparnasaso ika mitzvah lahalvosla. He says, in a situation where your friend currently, he certainly has money, right? He just needs to cover himself in the next 30 days because his cash flow is right. He doesn't have the cash flow. He doesn't have the liquidity. So therefore, there's a mitzvah to lend him money to just get him over that hump, even though he's not a poor person. So there we say that his needs take priority over lending the money to a non-Jew. But if it's just to allow him to make a profit, so then there's no obligation and there's no prioritization that he has over you using your money to make money yourself. And he says that's what the Chafetz Chaim is talking about as well. He wants to borrow money from you so that because of his he needs to sustain his business, but even if he doesn't use your money, he still has enough to feed his family. He says, if the guy mamish needs money to feed his family, so then you have an obligation to give, even not even to loan, but also to give. But rather, ela kavana b'halva meruba yoser laseis v'laseis bo laharbiach al yedei zeh parnasaso. Avolim zeh halva she'ena leparnasaso ela laharbos hono v'adai shelot siv sator lahakdima l'nafir. So what Rav Stern is basically doing is creating three levels. Level number one is where a guy needs money because he has such a shortfall he can't even buy groceries. So there's a mitzvah to either give him money or to lend him money, right? Either tzedakah or a loan, irrespective of other opportunities you have to make with your money. Madrega number two is where the guy needs a loan, but even if he doesn't take a loan, he can still feed his family, but his business may fail because he just needs enough to be able to cover payroll for the month. Does he have enough food in the house? Yeah, that he's covered for. But this is a typical middle class problem: is that he doesn't have enough liquidity to just cover the needs of his business. So there too, the Chafetz Chaim says there is a mitzvah to give him a loan, provided that the amount of money that you stand to make with the Gentile is not huge. There it's subjective, right? It's qualified somewhat in the sense that I have an obligation to loan you the money, right? You're not an ani, you still have food in your house, but I have a mitzvah to give you a halva'ah, provided that it doesn't deprive me of a huge opportunity that I could use with my money if I were liquid and held on to that money. And that's somewhat gray as far as how much that is, right? Then the third madrega is if the guy just wants the money because he has an investment opportunity, then, right, then it doesn't matter how much he tries to sell you on that. You're not at all obligated to lend him the money because, you'll be just fine without this business venture. You have your business, you have your family's well fed. You want to be able to go beyond that opportunity so that maybe you can retire a few years early or whatever it is. Then I'm not obligated if I have something else to do with my money. Then I have no obligation. So those are the three levels. Okay. So, right. So we haven't delved yet into the idea of arevut, of a guarantorship. We'll deal with that. I guess we're going to get to that. Yeah, I believe so. Okay, we'll hold it here for today.